Hello, everyone, and welcome to Ohio EPA's 2022 Virtual Compliance Assistance Conference. My name is Bill Narotsky, and I'm with the Division of Environmental Response and Revitalization here at Ohio EPA, and I will be moderating the Slippery Slopes of Used Oil Activities session. Ohio EPA's 2022 Virtual Compliance Assistance Conference has 24 sessions over 2 weeks. This is today's third session focusing on hazardous waste regulations. Registration information and a conference agenda are located on Ohio EPA's conference webpage. We hope you are able to join us for additional conference sessions. Please remember, it's never too late to sign up for the next conference session, and all sessions are being recorded for you to view later. Before we get started, we would like to point your attention to a regulatory exclusion. Did you know that solvent-contaminated wipes may be excluded from a hazardous waste rules if specific conditions are met? Scan the QR code on the slide to get more information about the wipe exclusions. The session's presenter is Zach Kabelin. Zach works in the Hazardous Waste Compliance Assurance section. He has worked 5 years at Ohio EPA as a hazardous waste enforcement case coordinator and helps provide compliance assistance to the regulated community. Previously, Zach spent more than 7 years as an environmental consultant, where he provided compliance support for environmental health and safety needs at industrial facilities. The session's behind-the-scene subject matter experts from the Hazardous Waste Compliance Assurance section are Tammy Heffelfinger and Christy Shipley. And with that, I would like to turn it over to our presenter. Here's Zach.
Thank you very much, Bill. As Bill said, my name is Zach Kabelin, and today I am going to go over the slippery slopes of used oil activities. So our learning objectives for today, we're going to talk about what the used oil rules are, what are the management standards for the different types of used oil facilities, and we'll talk a little bit about rebutting the presumption. And there's a lot of information here, so I will start going through everything. So Ohio's used oil regulations are found in Ohio Administrative Code, Chapter 3745-279, and the federal used oil regulations can be found in 40 CFR Part 279. And used oil has its own set of regulations that are separate from the hazardous waste regulations. And in 1980, Congress passed the Used Oil Recycling Act as an amendment to the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. And the mismanagement of used oil can pose a threat to humans and the environment. Improperly disposing of used oil can also lead to contamination of drinking water, surface water, groundwater, and soil. The used oil regulations describe proper used oil management. And because used oil is a reusable resource, the regulations also promote used oil recycling. And if your business manages used oil, you would be subject to these used oil regulations. So the used oil management standards are structured so used oil that will be recycled is subject to management under the Part 279 standards. And these standards are less stringent than our hazardous waste requirements. And the used oil management standards have been based on the presumption that all used oil is recyclable and therefore should be regulated under one set of standards. And this presumption applies regardless of whether the used oil exhibits a hazardous characteristic, and that would be at its point of generation, and regardless of whether the used oil will ultimately be recycled or disposed. And these management standards apply to all used oils until a person disposes of the used oil or sends it for disposal. Used oil that will be disposed disposed as solid waste and therefore must be evaluated to determine if it's a hazardous waste. And this recycling presumption applies only for as generated used oil. And its status may change if the used oil is mixed with hazardous waste or other materials. So what is used oil? Used oil means any oil that has been refined from crude oil or any synthetic oil that has been used and as a result of that use is contaminated by physical or chemical impurities. And to determine if a material is a used oil, there are 3 criteria that must be met. And the first one is its origin. Like I said, the material must be derived from either a crude oil or from synthetic oil. There is the use, and the material must have been used as a lubricant or, say, a hydraulic fluid or maybe a heat transfer fluid or for some other similar purpose. And materials that have not been used would not be considered a used oil. And then the last criteria is the contaminants, and the materials must be contaminated with either a physical or a chemical impurity from its use. And examples of a contamination could include anything from water to dirt, different types of solvents, or even something like metal shavings. So these are a few examples of what used oil can include or what it might not include. Those are such things as like engine oils or hydraulic fluids, or maybe you're using oil as a metal cutting fluid. There are certain things that would not be considered a used oil, and those are oil products, or say your animal and vegetable oils, or maybe even oil sludge from virgin oil tanks. So where is used oil found? When used oil is contained in a material such as an oil filter or maybe an absorbent pad, the items themselves would be regulated under the used oil standards. And these items would be regulated under those standards until the materials containing or otherwise contaminated with that used oil have been properly drained, or the used oil has been removed to the extent possible that there are no visible signs of any free-flowing oil. And then once the used oil is drained from these items, like once you drain the used oil out of an oil filter or even out of an engine, those items are no longer regulated by the used oil rules. So in most cases, used oil that is mixed with hazardous waste must be managed as hazardous waste and not a used oil. But there are several exceptions. And used oil that has been mixed with a household hazardous waste, or used oil mixed with hazardous waste that's been generated by a very small quantity generator, that can be managed as used oil. Used oil that has more than 1,000 parts per million of total halogen content is presumed to have been mixed with halogenated listed hazardous waste. And you can rebut this presumption if you can demonstrate that the halogens are not from a listed hazardous waste. And I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. Mixtures of a waste that exhibits one or more characteristics of a hazardous waste and used oil can be managed as used oil if, say, the resulting mixture does not exhibit any characteristic of hazardous waste. Otherwise, the mixture must be managed as a hazardous waste. And then used oil that is mixed with a waste that is hazardous solely because it exhibits the characteristic of ignitability can be managed as a used oil under the used oil standards if that mixture does not exhibit the ignitability characteristic. And that's regardless of any other hazardous characteristic that the mixture might exhibit. So during the development of the used oil regulations, US EPA found that used oil often contained high concentrations of halogens and especially chlorinated constituents. And it was determined that the source was often due to spent chlorinated solvents that had been mixed with the used oil. And because of these findings, if used oil is found to contain greater than 1,000 parts per million of total halogens, it is presumed that the used oil was mixed with a listed spent solvent. The rebuttable presumption places the burden of proof on handlers of the used oil to demonstrate that the used oil they manage has not been mixed with hazardous waste. And you would be able to rebut this presumption by demonstrating that the used oil does not contain hazardous waste. And they're essentially, the handlers have two methods by which they can make this demonstration. And that is by providing process information, which demonstrates that the used oil was contaminated by HHCs, and those are halogenated hazardous constituents that would not be in a listed hazardous waste, or a handler can demonstrate that the used oil does not contain significant concentrations of those HHCs by providing representative analytical data. Now, if you're rebutting the presumption, records of analysis conducted for information used to comply with rebutting the presumption needs to be maintained for at least 3 years. And if the rebuttal is successful, the used oil will be subject to the used oil regulations instead of the hazardous waste standards. And with that, we are coming up on our first poll. So our first poll question is, what are the different types of used oil activities? So we have generators, transporters, marketers, or burners, or all the above. It looks like maybe all the above is not on the actual poll.
Okay, the poll is launched, so please provide your responses. Looks like about 75% of you have responded so far. Those of you who have not responded, please go ahead and submit your responses. We will be closing the poll in a few moments. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll now, and let me share the results.
Okay, so I think I got a little ahead of myself there, and everyone, it's a little bit of a trick question. Everyone got it right because all of these would be considered types of used oil activities. So congratulations, everyone, on getting the answers correct. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about each of the used oil activities. And the used oil rules provide requirements for different activities that may be conducted by a facility. And generators are going to be the largest segment of the used oil industry. And then we have collection centers and aggregation points, and these accept small amounts of used oil and store it until enough is collected to ship elsewhere for recycling. And collection centers typically accept used oil from multiple sources, whereas aggregation points collect oil from places run by the same owner or operator. Next, we have transporters, and these are companies that will pick up used oil from all sources and deliver it to re-refiners or processors or burners of used oil. Re-refiners and processors are facilities that will blend or remove impurities from used oil so it can be burned for energy recovery or so it can be reused. We have marketers, and marketers either direct shipments of used oil to be burned as fuel in regulated devices, or they claim that certain EPA specifications are met for used oil to be burned for energy recovery in devices that are not regulated. And marketers will need to fall into at least one of these other categories. And I'll explain a little more on each of these as we go through the slides. But last and not least, we have burners, and burners burn used oil for energy recovery in boilers, industrial furnaces, or in hazardous waste incinerators. So this slide is just a quick table of our used oil management standards, and it provides the rules where you could find information for each of the management activities that a used oil, say, generator or marketer or burner would have to follow. So we're going to start off with used oil generators. And a used oil generator would be any person whose action or process first produces used oil or would cause used oil to become subject to the regulation. And used oil is commonly generated through vehicle or equipment maintenance. And some common businesses where used oil is generated would be machine shops or manufacturing companies or auto service stations. There are exceptions for used oil generators where the standards for used oil would not apply. And one of them would be a household do-it-yourselfer. And these are individuals who generate used oil through maintenance of their personal vehicles. We have vessels at Sierra Port, and used oil produced on vessels from normal shipboard operations is considered to be generated at the time that it's transported ashore. With diesel fuel, mixtures of used oil and diesel fuel that is mixed by the generator for use in their own vehicle would not be subject to the used oil rules, but prior to mixing, the used oil would be subject to the rules. And then we have farmers, and farmers who generate on average or an average of 25 gallons per month or less of used oil from their vehicles or their machinery used on the farm would not be subject to the used oil standards. Ohio's regulations include some specific requirements for used oil generators. And most of these regulations are going to be related to good housekeeping practices. And with labeling, containers and above ground storage tanks that would be used to store your used oil must be labeled or marked clearly with the words used oil. And fill pipes used to transfer used oil into underground storage tanks or above ground storage tanks must also be labeled and clearly marked with the words used oil. Your containers and tanks, containers in your above ground storage tanks used to store used oil at the generator's facility must be in good condition and not leaking. And when it comes to responses to releases, upon detection of a release, a generator will need to perform the following cleanup steps, and they will need to stop the release, contain any of the released used oil. You'll want to clean up and manage the released used oil and any other materials that were used to clean up the release. And if necessary, you'll want to repair or replace any of the leaking used oil storage containers and tanks prior to returning them to service. And then you'll also need to report that release. So if a release of used oil occurs, a verbal notification must be made to your local fire department, your local emergency planning committee, and to Ohio EPA within 30 minutes of knowledge of that release. And then the National Response Center should also be notified if oil is released to a navigable waterway. And your contact information, along with the location of the release, any estimated quantities, the time and duration of the release, and any response actions should be relayed during your initial notification. And then after the release, a written follow-up must be submitted within 30 days to Ohio EPA's emergency response section. And in that follow-up, you're going to want to include your facility information, where did the release occur, and indicate location of the facility, where the facility is located, county information, quantity of the oil released, any mitigation and containment actions that were taken. You want to provide a chronology of the events, any documentation and causes for the release, and any economic impact that might have been caused because of the release. And then any wastes that are generated during a response to a used oil release must be evaluated and then managed appropriately. So I'm talking about used oil storage. The Spill Prevention, Control, and Countermeasure Program, or better known as the SPCC program, was promulgated under federal regulations by US EPA, and it applies to non-transportation facilities that store oil and oil products. And because Ohio has not promulgated its own oil pollution prevention regulations, facilities in the state that are subject to the SPCC requirements must comply with the federal regulations, and those are found in 40 CFR Part 112. And for the SPCC regulations to apply, a facility must have an above-ground storage capacity of 1,320 gallons of oil. And it is important to note that the total capacity of your tanks or containers must be considered, and not the actual amount of oil stored or the portion commonly used. If you are storing oil in containers that are less than 55 gallons in size, you do not need to include these in calculating the storage capacity. Additionally, if your facility has a total above-ground storage capacity of 42,000 gallons or greater of oil, your facility would also be subject to the SPCC program. And if you are subject to the program, there are two basic requirements. You'll need to provide adequate secondary containment for oil or petroleum product storage and transfer areas to contain any releases. And you also need to prepare and implement a written SPCC plan. And there are basically two types of secondary containment. There's size secondary containment, and this is only really required for bulk storage containers. This type of secondary containment will be sized, or must be sized, to the largest tank or container with enough freeboard for a rain event. And the general rule of thumb is that the secondary containment is 110% of the largest tank or container, or it can hold a 25-year, 24-hour storm event, and that's whichever is greater. And then with general secondary containment, this only needs to account for the quantity of oil that is likely to be spilled in the event of a failure. And this includes more passive containment, such as a spill kit, or even a procedure to address the release. And in addition to secondary containment, you must have a written SPCC plan. And the plan must describe all measures taken at the facility to prevent and control a release of oil or petroleum products. The plan will need to include things such as your facility operations, your site security, if you have any spill histories, your notification procedures in the event of a release. You want to include facility site plans showing areas of oil storage and transfers. You want to include any oil storage inspection procedures. And there's more information, and you could find this additional information pertaining to the SPCC requirements on the US EPA website. With that, I believe it takes us to our second poll.
And Zach, go ahead and forward one more slide.
And there you go. Okay, so for our second question, it is, what is the total above ground storage quantity and gallons that makes a facility applicable to the SPCC program. And our answers are 550 gallons, 1,000 gallons, 1,320 gallons, or 42,000 gallons.
All right, I'm going to launch the poll now, and please select your response. Okay, it looks like 75% have responded. Those of you who have not yet responded, please go ahead and submit your responses, and we will be closing the poll in a few moments. All right, we're now going to go ahead and close the poll, so let me share the results with everybody.
All right, thank you, Bill. And the correct answer would be 1,320 gallons of total above ground storage quantity to make you applicable to the SPCC program. So great job. Looks like just over 3/4 of you got the correct answer. So moving along, I'm going to go over the management options for generators. And as a used oil generator, you have several recycling and management options for the used oil that you generate, but under no circumstances can you dispose of your used oil on your property. You can transport small amounts of used oil generated at your site to a registered used oil collection center without being subject to the used oil transport requirements if you use your own vehicle or a vehicle owned by an employee and you are not transferring more than 55 gallons at a time. You can transport small amounts of used oil that you generate to aggregation points that you own. And the same rules apply as for the transportation to a used oil collection center. And you can use your own vehicle or a vehicle owned by an employee, and you may not transfer more than 55 gallons at a time. You may burn used oil in the space heater. And the best way to manage your used oil is to send it to a used oil recycler for either reconditioning, re-refining, reuse, or it'll be burned for energy recovery. And if you plan to send your used oil offsite to used oil recycler, you're going to need to use a used oil transporter who has a US EPA ID number. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, as a business owner, you can burn any used oil that has not been mixed with the hazardous waste that you generate at any of your places of business, or any used oil that you collect from household do-it-yourselfers in your space heater without having to notify Ohio EPA and obtain an EPA identification number, as long as the burner that you're using burns only used oil that the owner or operator generates, or used oil received from a household do-it-yourselfer. The heater is designed to have a maximum capacity of not more than 500,000 BTU per hour, and the combustion gases from the heater need to be vented outside to the ambient air. And you cannot burn used oil from other businesses in your space heater unless the used oil is on specification. So used oil that someone has shown to have a constituent concentration or have constituent concentration levels below those listed in the table above or above 100 degrees Fahrenheit will meet the used oil specification. And this used oil is often referred to as on-specification used oil. And although the used oil specification's total halogen regulatory limit is 4,000 parts per million, if the total halogens exceed 1,000 parts per million, this goes back to rebutting the presumption. Ohio EPA presumes that the used oil has been mixed with the listed hazardous waste, and that's unless you can rebut the presumption and show that it wasn't. Used oil that exceeds any of the levels or that has not been proven to meet the concentration levels is called off-specification used oil. And until it's been shown that the used oil meets the specification, Ohio EPA will presume that it's off specification. Once it has been established that the used oil meets the fuel specification, the scope of regulations that apply to the used oil diminishes dramatically. If the entity that asserts that the used oil is on specification meets the following conditions, then neither the used oil requirements or any other RCRA requirement applies to that material. The entity must document the finding that the used oil meets the specification via testing or other methods and retain those records for 3 years. The entity must have an EPA ID number, and they will need to maintain records of any shipments of the on-specification oil to any used oil burners. And once these conditions are met, the on-specification used oil is not subject to RCRA regulation and may be managed the same as any other conventional fuel. And on-specification used oil may be burned in any type of combustion unit. When burning, the burning of off-specification oil with high concentrations of the constituents listed in the earlier slides, this could cause an increased risk of cancer to exposed individuals. The high halogen levels could also contribute to acid rain. And these are some of the reasons why off-specification used oil is only allowed to be burned in certain units. And burning off-specification used oil subjects a facility to the used oil burner standards. And these standards limit the types of units in which off-specification used oil may be burned and impose additional requirements on that facility. And the 4 types of units listed on the slide are the only units allowed to burn off-specification used oil because they address EPA's air emission concerns. And these types of units typically use high efficiency boilers. They have significant air pollution controls associated with them, and often are not located in residential areas. As a used oil generator, you may burn off specification used oil on site in space heaters without complying with those burner standards provided. And I talked a little bit about this in a previous slide. Only used oil that the facility generates or receives from a household do-it-yourselfer can be burned in these heaters. Again, the space heater cannot be rated more than 500,000 BTU per hour, and those gases from the space heater need to be vented outside. And generators taking advantage of this exception do not have to determine whether the used oil meets the fuel specification. And if the space heater exceeds the BTU capacity limit, then it's a non-industrial boiler and you cannot burn the off-specification used oil. So the specification determination would have to be made. The presence of PCBs in used oil is not one of the used oil fuel specifications, meaning used oil can be on specification even if it contains between 2 and 50 parts per million PCBs. And US EPA has made note that used oil containing PCBs that will be burned for energy recovery is subject to the TSCA regulations. PCB contaminated used oil containing between 2 and 50 parts per million of PCBs may only be combusted in the following types of units, and those are TSCA or RCRA incinerators. TSCA high efficiency boilers, industrial furnaces or boilers that are defined in 260.10, and utility boilers. And certain notification requirements would apply as well. And although the RECLA regulations do not identify the presence of PCBs in used oil as relevant to the determination of whether the used oil is on or off specification, the presence of PCBs in used oil is relevant for determining the applicability of the TSCA regulations for the burning of used oil. And burning used oil containing greater than 50 parts per million PCBs for energy recovery is strictly prohibited. So moving on, hopefully I don't have to say specification anymore in this presentation, but we're going to talk about transporters of used oil. And a used oil transporter is any person that does any one of the following, and that's transports used oil, collects used oil from more than one used oil generator and transports the used oil, collects and transports absorbents contaminated with used oil, operates or owns a used oil transfer facility, conducts incidental treatment, and this would include bulking individual containers of used oil, draining used oil from oil filters, and separating used oil from absorbent materials. The used oil transporter may transport used oil to any of the following facilities, and they could transport to another transporter. They can transport to a processor or a refiner, an off-specification, there it is again, off-specification used oil burner or an on-specification used oil burner if someone has acted as a marketer, and I'll talk more about exactly what a marketer is later in the presentation. And a used oil transporter may also act as a transfer facility. And generators may transport small amounts of used oil to collection centers or aggregation points without needing to follow the requirements for a used oil transporter. Transporters who have not previously notified Ohio EPA of their regulated waste activity will need to obtain a US EPA ID number. And transporters must determine if the used oil contains less than 1,000 parts per million of total halogens and retain those records of the analysis used to make the determination for 3 years. They'll need to comply with all applicable DOT requirements. They'll need to manage all residues from transporting or the storage of used oil. And they must retain records of all shipments and deliveries for at least 3 years. And those records must include the name and address of the used oil provider or receiver. This will need to include that US EPA ID number, the quantity of the used oil accepted or delivered, the date, and then it will need to have the signature of the receiver or the provider of the used oil. If a transporter has a release of used oil during transportation, they'll need to take immediate action to protect human health and the environment and contain that release, and also notify local emergency authorities. They also need to call Ohio EPA's DERS Emergency Response Program and follow up with a written report. A used oil transfer facility is any transportation-related facility that this would include loading docks or storage areas and other areas where shipments of used oil are held for more than 24 hours, but not longer than 35 days during the normal course of transportation. And transfer facilities must store used oil in tanks or containers that are in good condition and are not leaking. The used oil container storage areas, they'll need to equip used oil storage container areas with secondary containment that is sufficiently impervious to used oil to prevent any used oil migration. They'll need to label all used oil storage tanks. And this includes fill pipes to underground storage tanks and containers with the word used oil. And then with everything else, upon detection of a release, they'll need to stop the release, contain the release of the used oil, clean up and manage the released used oils and any other remediation materials. They'll want to replace or repair any containers or tanks prior to returning them to use. And then again, waste that are generated during a response to used oil release will need to be evaluated and managed appropriately. If you store used oil for greater than 35 days, the used oil transfer facility will become subject to the requirements for used oil processors and used oil re-refiners. And these requirements are much more comprehensive than the transfer facility standards. And you would be required to develop a preparedness and prevention plan, as well as develop and maintain and distribute a contingency plan for your facility. You'd also be required to perform closure on your used oil storage areas when the facility closes down. So when talking about used oil processors or re-refiners, these are anyone who uses chemical or physical operations to produce fuel oils, lubricants, or other products derived from used oil. And they must follow the used oil processing standards. And you are also subject to the processing rules if you use chemical or physical operations to make used oil more amenable for production of fuel, lubricants, or other products derived from used oil. And processing includes, but is not necessarily limited to, blending used oil with virgin petroleum products, blending used oil to meet the fuel specifications, filtration, simple distillation, chemical or physical separation, and re-refining. Processors and re-refiners of used oil should notify Ohio EPA of their used oil management activities, even if they have already received a US EPA ID number. And if you do not have a US EPA ID number, but are conducting the activities that I talked about on the previous slide, you must notify Ohio EPA and obtain one. And processors and re-refiners of used oil need to adhere to a more stringent requirements than generators or transporters of used oil will need to. And these include things like general safety and emergency standards, general facility standards. They'll need to have a used oil analysis plan, report biannually to Ohio EPA on their activities, track receipts and shipments of all used oil, and then also maintain a written operating record. Used oil processors and re-refiners must store used oil in tanks or containers that are in good condition and have no visible leaks. I mean, these are the same sort of requirements as all the other activities. Containers and tanks must be equipped with secondary containment systems that consist of dikes, berms, or retaining walls, and a floor that covers the entire area within the dike, berm, or retaining wall. Much like our other activities for used oil, containers and tanks need to be labeled or marked clearly with the words used oil. While you are not required to label underground storage tanks, you must label their fill pipes with the words used oil. In the event of a release, a used oil processor or a used oil re-refiner will need to stop the release, contain that release, clean up and manage properly the released used oil and any other materials. If necessary, repair or replace any leaking used oil storage containers. And I want to make sure that a waste determination is made or the used oil is evaluated and managed properly. Unlike the other management activities, closure of above ground tanks and containers will need to be completed. That includes removing containers used to store used oil or associated residues, removing or decontaminating used oil tanks, remove or decontaminate containment system components, removing or decontaminating structures and equipment, and then removing or decontaminating any soils that have come up into contact with the used oil. Processors and refiners must develop and follow a written analysis plan, which describes how they will determine if the used oil they collect has been mixed with the hazardous waste. And the analysis plan must specify whether the processor or the refiner will use analytical data or process knowledge to verify that the used oil has not been mixed with the hazardous waste. And if using analytical data, the analysis plan will need to include a sampling method used to obtain the representative samples, the frequency of testing, whether the analysis will be performed on-site or off-site, and then the methods used to analyze specified parameters such as the percent oil or the percent solids. Used oil processors and re-refiners will need to keep a record of each used oil shipment accepted for transport and each used oil delivery. And those records need to include the name and address and US EPID number of the transporter, name and address and US EPID number of the generator or the receiving facility, quantity of the used oil accepted or shipped, and the date of the acceptance or delivery of the used oil. And those records need to be maintained for at least 3 years. And those can take on the form of a log or an invoice or even a manifest or some other type of shipping document. A processor or refiner of used oil must keep an operating record and a record of all shipments to and from the facility. And the operating record must contain all records and results of used oil analysis performed and the details of any incidents that require the implementation of that contingency plan. Used oil analysis performed in summary reports must be recorded and as becomes available and maintained in the operating record until closure of your facility. A processor or refiner will need to report to the director in a form of a letter on a biennial basis by March 1st of each even numbered year the following information concerning the used oil activities during the previous calendar year. And they'll need to include their ID number, their name and address of the actual processor or re-refiner facility, the calendar year covered by the report, and then the quantities of used oil accepted for processing or re-refining and the manner in which the used oil is processed or re-refined, including the specific processes employed. The processors and refiners will need to have a written contingency plan that describes planned emergency response actions. And the contingency plan must include all the following: details of emergency response arrangements made with local authorities, a list of names and addresses and phone numbers of everyone qualified as an emergency coordinator. If there's more than one person that's listed, you must name a primary emergency coordinator and then list the remaining coordinators in the order that they would assume responsibility. An up-to-date list of all required emergency equipment, including location, physical description, and a brief capability will need to be outlined. And you also need to include an evacuation plan for personnel. And at any time you implement your contingency plan, you must record the time, date, and details of the incident in your operating record. Within 15 days of the incident, you must submit a written report to the Director of Ohio EPA. Some general operating standards. At least one employee must always be available to coordinate emergency measures. The employee must be located on site or be able to reach the facility within a short period of time. The responsible emergency coordinator must be thoroughly familiar with all aspects of the contingency plan, including all operations, all activities, the location and characteristic of the used oil handled, the location of all records within your facility, and the facility layout. And if the emergency coordinator determines that the release, a fire, or an explosion could threaten human health or the environment outside the facility, the findings must immediately be reported to the appropriate local authorities. Immediately after an emergency, the coordinator must provide full recycling, storing, and disposing of recovered used oil, contaminated soil or surface water, or any other resulting material. Processors and refiners must make prior arrangements with local authorities who may respond during the emergency. They must maintain and operate the facility to minimize the possibility of fire or explosion or any unplanned release of used oil. Depending on the possible hazards posed by the used oil, the facility must have communication or alarm system set up, a device capable of summoning emergency assistance, fire control equipment, and water to supply some sort of water or spray system. And Ohio's used oil regulations do not specify a required aisle space distance. However, you must maintain adequate aisle space to allow the unobstructed movement of personnel, fire protection equipment, spill control equipment, and decontamination equipment to any area of the facility in the event of an emergency. If your used oil management, if your used oil management activities meet the definition of used oil processing, you do not have to follow the processor rules if you are a used oil transporter who conducts incidental processing operations during the normal course of transportation. You are a used oil burner who mixes off-specification used oil with either virgin oil or on-specification used oil solely for the purpose of burning, or you are a used oil generator that conducts any one of the following activities. That includes filtering, cleaning, or otherwise reconditioning used oil before reusing it on site, separating used oil from on-site generated wastewater to make sure the wastewater is more acceptable for discharge or reuse, draining or otherwise removing used oil from materials in order to remove excessive oil to the extent possible, or filtering, separating, or otherwise reconditioning used oil before burning it in a space heater that you own. I think with that takes us to our last poll question. I know we're coming up on time, so I don't know if we want to skip this or go ahead with it because I do have a few more slides to go through.
Let's go ahead and quickly do the poll. Sometimes they are needed for CEU credit, okay?
Okay, all right.
Okay, go ahead, good. Right there.
Okay, with our last poll question, which of the following constituents are sampled to determine if used oil is on specification, and you can select all that apply? We have arsenic, barium, selenium, lead, and zinc.
And the poll has been launched, so please go ahead and put in your answers. Looks about 75% of you have responded. Let's go ahead and submit your responses as soon as you can, and we'll be closing the poll in just a few moments. Okay, we're closing the poll now, and I will share the results.
Okay, so the constituents that are sampled to determine if used oil is on specification, looks like a lot of you got these correct because, well, the most were correct when saying arsenic and lead. So great job on that one, everyone.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Bill. I will continue on. So talking about off-specification used oil burners, a used oil burner is any person who burns used oil that does not meet the specification standards, burns used oil for purposes of energy recovery, and burns the used oil in either a boiler or an industrial furnace. The used oil burner will need to notify Ohio EPA. They will need to retain records of all accepted shipments of used oil for at least 3 years, and the records will need to include the name and address and US EPA ID number of the used oil transporter, name, address, and US EPA ID number, if applicable, of the generator or the processor refiner where the used oil came from, the date of acceptance, and then the quantity of the used oil received. Prior to accepting any used oil, they will need to provide the supplying generator, transporter, or processor or refiner a one-time written and signed notice certifying that they have notified Ohio EPA of the used oil management activities and will only burn the used oil in the boiler or industrial furnace. And this certification must be maintained for 3 years. And the used oil burner will also determine if the used oil contains less than 1,000 parts per million of total halogens. Used oil burners must store used oil in tanks or containers that are in good condition. These requirements are the same for all the other used oil activities. There shouldn't be any visible leaks. The containers and tanks must be equipped with secondary containment that consists of either dikes or berms or retaining walls. Your containers and tanks, your fill pipes, they'll all need to be labeled and marked clearly with the words used oil. In the event of a release, the used oil burner must perform all the following, and that includes stopping the release, containing that release, cleaning up any used oil and any other materials, if necessary, repair, and then evaluate any used oil that was cleaned up during that release. Used oil burners will need to keep a record of each used oil shipment that they accepted for burning, and that will need to include the name and the address of the transporter who delivered that used oil, name and address of the generator or processor or the refiner who sent the used oil to be burned, the EPA ID numbers for those facilities, the quantity of the used oil accepted, and then the date of the acceptance. And then those records must be maintained for at least 3 years. Moving on to our last activity, we have the used oil fuel marketer. And a used oil fuel marketer is any person that conducts either of the following activities, and that is the direct shipments of off-specification used oil from their facility to a used oil burner, or they first claim that the used oil that is to be burned for energy recovery meets the used oil specifications. This does not apply to used oil generators and transporters who send shipments of off-specification used oil to processors, even if those processors incidentally burn the used oil. The marketer regulations also do not apply to persons who direct shipments of on-specification used oil, but are not the first person to claim the used oil meets the specification, and generators that burn their own on-specification used oil for energy recovery in on-site boilers or industrial furnaces are by definition used oil fuel marketers. And in order to avoid the burner standards, they must determine that their used oil meets the used oil specification. And that puts them into the marketer category via the second activity listed on the slide. Any person subject to the requirements of a used oil fuel marketer must also comply with the standards for generators, transporters, processors or refiners, or used oil burners who burn off specification used oil for energy recovery. A used oil fuel marketer will need to notify Ohio EPA for off-specification used oil delivery. Any used oil marketer who directs a shipment of off-specification used oil to burner will need to keep a record of each shipment of used oil to that burner. When it comes to on-specification used oil delivery, a generator, transporter, processor, refiner, or burner who first claims that the used oil that is to be burned for energy recovery meets the fuel specifications must keep a record of each shipment of the used oil to the facility which it delivers that used oil to. That will include the name and address of the facility receiving the shipment, the quantities of the used oil that are being delivered, the date of the shipment or the delivery, and then a cross-reference to the record of used oil analysis used to make a determination that the used oil meets the specification. And before a used oil generator or transporter or processor or refiner directs the first shipment of off-specification used oil fuel to a burner, they'll need to obtain a one-time written and signed notice from the burner certifying that they have notified Ohio EPA of their used oil management activities. The burner will only burn the used oil in a boiler or industrial furnace, and that certification will need to be maintained for at least 3 years. There are several prohibitions for the management of used oil, which include the following. Used oil must be managed, must not be managed in surface impoundments or waste piles unless it's subject to regulation. The use of used oil as a dust suppressant is prohibited. Off-specification used oil fuel must be burned for energy recovery and only the following devices, and that is industrial furnaces, boilers, which will include industrial boilers, utility boilers, and used oil-fired space heaters, provided that they meet the burner provisions and OAC 3745-279-23, which is what we talked about in previous slides, or hazardous waste incinerators. Used oil that will be disposed rather than recycled is going to be a solid waste, and therefore before the facility may dispose used oil, it must first determine whether material is a RCRA hazardous waste. And used oil is a hazardous waste if it exhibits a hazardous waste characteristic by its own nature or by mixing with a characteristically hazardous waste. It has been mixed with an ignitable, corrosive, or reactive only listed waste and continues to exhibit a characteristic. It has been mixed with a non-ignitable, corrosive, or reactive only listed waste, or contains greater than 1,000 parts per million of total halogens, and the presumption that it has been mixed with hazardous waste cannot be rebutted. Wastes that are generated during response to a used oil release must be evaluated and managed appropriately. And I know I said that multiple times throughout the presentation, but that's important to know that you need to evaluate your used oil if it's going to be disposed of and manage it appropriately. And with that, I believe that is my last slide.
Great. Thank you very much, Zach. That was a great presentation with a lot of good information. We unfortunately do not have enough time for questions. However, you can still submit questions through the questions pane, and we will reach out to you by email following today's session with our responses. Again, thank you, Zach, for your great presentation. Thank you to our subject matter experts, Tammy and Christy, and our technical team. Also, thank you everyone for attending the 2022 Virtual Compliance Assistance Conference session. As we end today's session, please consider Ohio EPA's Encouraging Environmental Excellence Award Program, or E3. It recognizes entities for excellent achievements in environmental stewardship by industry, communities, and by schools. If your organization is going beyond what is regulatorily required to reduce your environmental impact, or if you're interested in what other E3 award winners have done, please check out the E3 program by scanning the QR code. And lastly, Ohio EPA hosts a series of webinars throughout the year on a variety of environmental topics. This slide provides information on how to register for these upcoming webinars, where to find recordings of previous webinars, and how to sign up to receive notifications of upcoming webinars through our Ohio EPA Customer Support Center. And with that, we will now end this session of Ohio EPA's 2022 Virtual Compliance Assistance Conference. We hope you are able to join us for other conference sessions tomorrow and the rest of this week and next week. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great day.